Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Duchan, and we're here to welcome you to the Trail Analytics and Data Storytelling Conference session. Thanks for joining. So I'm a design principal in Alta's Los Angeles office, and I've been with Alta since 2009. Over the years, I've worked on a range of complete street and trail corridor projects, from planning through design and construction, and I'm happy to be joined today by Mike, Mitali, and Devin.
Thanks, Emily. My name is Mike Sellinger. I'm a planner with Alta Planning and Design in our Portland office. I'm part of our Civics Analytics group, and I lead a lot of our projects that involve trail analytics.
Thanks, Mike. This is Mitali Gupta. I work for the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, commonly referred to as Metro. I'm a manager with Metro's planning department within the Mobility Corridors Group. And in my role, I manage one of the most complex active transportation project in LA County, the LA River Path, which we are partnering with Emily, Devin, and Mike, but more on that later on.
And I'm Devin Young, design principal with Alta. I lead our signature trails practice area at Alta and have the pleasure, as Mitali mentioned, of working together with Emily, Mike, and Mitali on the LA River Path, as well as several large trail projects across the United States.
So for over 20 years, Alta has been specializing in the planning, design, and implementation of corridors and networks for people who bike, walk, take transit, and use low-speed mobility devices. Because our project areas are often very large, analytical tools are an essential part of our process. So we have offices across the country. Devin, Mike, and I are all on the West Coast. Mitali is based in Southern California, and she'll tell you a little bit about Metro.
So Metro is not only LA County's transit provider, but it is also the county's transportation planner, designer, builder of transit, highways, and non-motorized means of transportation. In Metro, we serve a very diverse service. We have a very diverse area. We cover nearly 1,400 square miles and serve nearly 10 million residents, comprising of a diverse stakeholder population. With about 32 languages in our area, 8% of our population being Hispanic, 20%, 14% Asian, 8% African, and about 3% like with the broad spectrum of ethnicities. We'll delve deeper into it when we discuss Metro's equity platform later on.
So although we have pre-recorded this session, we'd still like to make it as interactive as possible. So feel free to use the chat function, and we'll do our best to respond to the Q&A through the live chat function when this airs. We're going to start today with an overview of analytical tools, and then we'll be diving into 3 case studies. And we picked these 3 projects because they represent a range of scales and land uses. So the LA River Path project is an 8-mile gap closure in a very urban context. The Iron Horse Trail is a 32-mile cross-county trail in a more suburban context. And the Great Redwood Trail is a 300-mile corridor in a beautiful rural setting. So we'll be focusing on a broad range of analytical tools. And if you're looking for detailed information on trail counts, this isn't the particular session for you, but there's still lots to learn. So we're going to start with looking sort of high level and why we model for trails. And when you see a flow chart like this, you know you're in the right place for a presentation on analytics. So we're starting with this chart because it really summarizes the whole process and all these bits and pieces we're going to be talking about today into one slide. And when we start our planning, start a planning or design project, whether it's upgrading an existing trail or building out a new corridor, it's really critical to understand who the users will be and where they travel. So you can see there's a range of data inputs in the left-hand column of boxes. And once you understand that, you can start to model travel patterns, which is a valuable tool in an alternatives analysis to help understand the best trail alignment. You can also model potential trail demand, and this is really getting at how wide the path needs to be and how comfortable we want it to be. So we have two models to answer those questions. And then trail demand can be used to help calculate trail benefits, which is a really extremely valuable tool when you're seeking funding. So for a more visual example, we know that when you have fewer people with lower and less variable speeds, an 8 to 12 foot shared use path is suitable. But as your demand increases and you have more people that may be traveling higher and more variable speeds, your path width and user separation need to increase. So the tools we're going to look at and talk about today to help really understand those users and quantify demand and mode splits so that you can be efficiently planning and designing a resilient trail. So there's lots of tools that apply to a range of scales and corridor types, and each project benefits from using a number of these tools as they all provide answers to different types of questions. They also require differing data inputs. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike, who will be highlighting a number of the tools most applicable to trails.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm going to talk through some of those data sources and tools that we use with a pretty high level overview, and then happy to answer any questions for more specifics in the Q&A or through email afterwards. So one of the first main data sources we use is census data. This gives us the ability to kind of understand who is near and may use a trail. And one of the main sources there is the American Community Survey. This is often, if people just say census data, what they mean. This is an annual survey that asks people questions about where they live, their income, how they travel to work, and things like that. So one of the limitations is it's just looking at where people live. So we like to supplement that with other data sources, one of them being the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamic Survey, or the LEHD. And that looks at where people are working, and then we can tie back their characteristics about where they live, so we can understand if people working near the trail have short commutes or long commutes, and that can help us understand who might use the path. A couple of things to keep in mind about this data source is just that there is a lot of a lag time. ACS data, or American Community Survey, is a 5-year sample when you're looking at census tracts around a trail. And even the most recent year of data is 2 or 3 years old by the time you get it processed. So it's important to think about in areas that have changed rapidly that you're going to need to use some other data sources such as counts or surveys to really understand those changes. Next slide, please. So one of the big things Emily mentioned we try to get at is potential demand. And this is a really complicated topic that we could spend a lot of time talking on. So today I'm just going to talk briefly about the factors that influence demand, and then 4 of the most common methods we use to estimate demand. So the first is these factors that we know through many different studies influence bike ped demand or use. And those are things like land use. Is there a mix of destinations? How dense is the population or the employment near an area? Another piece is demographics. We know certain people bike and walk at different rates. If there happens to be a college campus nearby, that's going to get different use than if you're in a low density residential neighborhood. Another piece is the natural environment, and that composes a couple of pieces. First, weather. If it's below 0 or over 100 degrees, that's going to impact use. And also topography. Do we have a lot of slopes? Is it going to be difficult for some people to walk or bike on the trail? Another piece is the network connectivity. You often hear people talk about a network is only as good as its weakest link. So even if you have the perfect trail built, if it doesn't interface with that network or there aren't good connections, you're not going to see much use there. Another piece is the quality of the facility. Obviously, a world-class trail is going to attract more people than a very narrow path with not much around it. And then finally, a big one is attitudes and perceptions. And this deals not just with what people think about walking or biking or trails, but also how safe they feel on it. And when we think about perceived safety, there's kind of 2 pieces of it. Do they feel safe from motor vehicles and other traffic? Is there enough separation or protection? And then the other piece of that is, do they feel safe from harassment or potential crime? So using all of those factors, we have 4 methods that we use to get at an estimate for demand on a facility. The first is a trip or activity-based model. And this is often, if you've heard about transportation demand models, this is that same type of thing where we're looking at a 4-step modeling process to estimate how many people would walk or bike on it. So these can be very complicated and are very robust in some areas, but certain areas, many parts of the country don't have models that incorporate people walking or biking. So that's often, and it can be very expensive to add those pieces into an existing model. So it's often not an option. But on the other hand, we are seeing a lot more effort put into modeling bike and pedestrian activity. So that's something to really keep an eye on as we move forward. Another way to get at demand is something called direct demand. And this one is really looking at those factors I mentioned earlier and building a regression model and then looking at how those factors are present in the area. What's the population density nearby? What is that network connectivity? And then using a regression model to estimate based from real data from other trails, what would that look like on your proposed trail? Another way to get at demand is scenario planning. And this is usually at a much broader level and typically done over a region perhaps, and looking at different investment scenarios and different land use and transportation facilities and thinking through how that would impact bicycling and walking and thus demand for those facilities. And then finally, the last one I'll mention is factoring or sketch planning. And this is essentially taking comparable projects or existing projects and applying them to your new project. So it can be as simple as a quick back of the envelope calculation. We saw this many trips after a trail was built here, or this is a similar trail, so we expect it here, or much more robust and taking into account all of the different nuances. And so that's another method for getting at demand. And just the final thing I'll say about that is those 4 ones I mentioned really vary hugely in how much resources they take, so that what you're really going to, when choosing one, you need to think through, how much time and money you want to spend on that demand estimate and how you're going to use that estimate. Switching gears a little bit to a different tool, I want to talk about the FHWA Shared Use Path Level of Service tool. This is a publicly available tool. Anybody can download it, and it lets you look at how wide the path should be based on demand estimates and the user mode split you expect. So the way I kind of like to think about this tool is it's how much water you can fit into a pipe and move it efficiently. So this is a really good tool to use when you're starting out to think about those design qualities of how wide a path would be based on expected users and demand. One thing it account for other aspects of user experience. And it also kind of presupposes the purpose of this trail is just to move people as efficiently as possible, which for many trails it might be, but there are other situations where we really don't care as much as that perfect efficiency, but we're designing for a mix of uses, and it's okay if people are mixing and moving slower and there's some more conflict. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, since it doesn't get at some of those other characteristics of a trail, we've developed a level of comfort tool that tries to analyze that and apply that to different trails. So looking at these 5 bullets you see listed here, we can combine that with the level of service to really get a full picture of the design experience and the user experience on a trail. So things we're looking at are vehicle stress. So you can see some of these pictures here. We have different scores of, fully separated from traffic or an unprotected crossing perhaps versus, a fence next to a train, and that will result in a different score. We also look at things like slopes. How steep is it in terms of average slope or max slope in different sections? And then thinking about the context and views. What's the surrounding land use experience going to be like? Is it a crowded waterfront or perhaps more of a recreational trail through a park? And then finally, also looking a bit at perceived crime risk and the solar index. The final thing I want to talk about today is benefits analysis and how we think about the benefits of trails. And I think this has two really key pieces of why this is important. First is trails provide benefits throughout the community, and I think that's something that many people, if they're do not see themselves as a trail user or haven't used in the past, don't fully understand. So we can use this benefits analysis to show how the trails are impacting community-wide and things like air quality, and health benefits. And then the second one, as Emily mentioned, is it's really key for funding. Many grant programs, including build grants, which will be coming out, the new guidance any day now, require a cost benefit analysis. So this is a key piece if you're looking at funding trail projects through many different grant programs. And the way we typically look at these benefits is breaking it into these three broad categories. The first being health and environmental benefits. So we know that a certain number of users of the trail are replacing those trips with motor vehicle trips. So that's going to have some environmental benefits in terms of air quality and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And it's also going to have health benefits in terms of newly active users, people who would not have been meeting physical activity guidelines before and are now getting more activity. We also like to look at the transportation and access benefits. Those same people switching out of cars to take a biking or walking trip are reducing congestion. They can be reducing collisions from less vehicles miles traveled, wear and tear on the roadways, and things like that. And then finally, the economic piece. There's more and more studies about how trails bring in economic development and economic spending of people who use trails, visiting businesses and spending more in areas near trails. And finally, also the construction benefits. Building a large trail project generates a lot of benefits around construction. So I think with that, I'll stop, and that's kind of the overview of some of these tools, and now we can dive into some of the specific case studies.
Thank you, Mike. I had to unmute my mic. Again, this is Mitali, and I'm going to introduce Metro's LA River Path project. Next slide, Emily, please. So the LA River Path, just as a context, is indicated in that green band in the map. It's an urban project cutting through the heart of downtown LA. It's an 8-mile bike path bridging the largest gap of regional active transportation corridor along the LA River. The extent of the path is from Elysian Valley in the city of Maywood, connecting to the existing, it's from Elysian Valley to the city of Maywood, and it connects to the existing pathways on the west bank of the river, and it is indicated by the blue line. The project is currently in its environmental phase and 15% design development. When complete, the path will provide a 32-mile grade-separated continuous active transportation corridor along the river. It is anticipated that this facility, around this facility, there will be about 100 million people within biking distance, and we'll be able to connect to jobs and activity centers throughout the LA area. On the onset of this project, we created goals. Pretty much talks about, just alluded to previously, about the safe active transportation ages and abilities, as well as multiple. This is going to be for bicyclists. This is going to be for people in wheelchairs, for people walking, moving at a variety of different speeds, while the focus being on enhancing recreation, livability, and regional connectivity. Next slide. So we came up with 6 goals, and they are safety, access, efficient and sustainable mobility, equity, user experience, and health. These are nothing new, but these reflect good project practice and helps shape our design of the project. Other than the goals, I'd like to take your focus onto the picture on the slide. That is our corridor. And not only is it very urban, but it is highly constrained. We're dealing with quite a few challenges around existing infrastructures around the river. Right next to the river, there is a number of active rail lines, both passenger rail, commuter, as well as long distance like Amtrak, Metrolink, as well as freight lines. We're navigating some 30 bridges in this 8-mile section. And we really have to be creative when it comes to the engineering of this project and provide access to communities on both sides of the river, especially since there are long stretches within this 8-mile corridor where there is literally no land on the bank for the path to come in. Next slide. So in terms of analytics, we looked at it in 3 different ways. We did an equity analysis, we did an OND, origin and destination study, and we also did a level of service or level of comfort study. So the first one that we looked at was the equity consideration as along this path, both in terms of what it would look like, where the access points would be, and where the path would be located along the river and who it would be serving. We also developed a very robust origin destination analysis to understand where the users are coming from and where they intend going. And finally, the level of service and level of comfort was an understanding to understand it is important because we are trying to provide this path for all ages and abilities. So understanding the level of comfort becomes very important in trail design. The picture that is shown on the slide, it's conceptual design or conceptual rendering of some of the things that we are thinking about. For example, as you can see that there are these utility towers. So instead of going around the utility towers, why not go through them if there is enough width to accommodate a path? It would be kind of unique to bike on a path which is right next to the railroad, next to the river, and then traversing through the towers. Next slide. So, well, with regards to equity, Metro has developed and adopted an equity framework in 2018, and currently back in 2021, we have equity tools which we will be using in evaluating the trail-oriented communities for this project. This is a Metro board adopted policy that applies to all our transportation projects regardless of mode. And so what we are doing is we are looking closely at equity and what that means and how that informs our projects, both in terms of which ones to advance and how they are designed. The equity platform threshold is supposed to promote consistency within our projects agency-wide. It looks at low income, non-white population, and zero car households as the most reliable metrics for identifying equity communities. Our equity neighborhoods are low income, having greater than 80% non-white population and greater than 10% household with zero car ownership. Plus, we also looked into the origin destination in terms of where these people are coming from and where they are going to go. The blue map, so each of these maps show low income, they show non-white households and zero car ownership. But the last one, the lower right-hand corner, the blue and gray map, kind of is a composite of all the 3 maps, and which meet any of the thresholds like low income, non-white population, and zero car household thresholds. And as you can see within our 8-mile corridor, there's quite a number of areas that are popping up in blue, which show that they are priority communities for Metro to think about from an equity lens. Next slide. So as I mentioned, that this path is an urban path and it's really connecting to jobs and number of activities in high demand areas. So we also have to think about who the users would be, because we are designing this as a multi-use path, serving a number of users. We are not exactly sure yet who they might be, but they could be vendors, people with small carts, and so it's important to understand what the path might look like and how it would impact the trail design. So basically, the idea is to create a space for all users. It's a friendly trail that every user can use. And so we have to be very cognizant of the speed and the grade and the comfort for each user class. Grade and slopes are particularly kept in mind while designing the path, especially when it maneuvers, those 30 bridges that I mentioned, the towers, the railroads, and other constraints along the corridor. In addition, we also need to make sure that the conflict points are reduced between kind of the slower moving path users and the I won't say high speed, but faster speed users like the bikers or the skateboarders or the skaters. Moving on to the next slide. So really, other than the southern stretch of the corridor, there are only a few spots where we can use existing land, because for the majority of the 8 miles, there's really not much available piece of land where we can put this trail on. So the team came up with 4 possible path types to accommodate the corridor constraints. So the first one, the upper left, the elevated one, where we are looking at creating a path high up in the air and elevated on structures using columns. And then the cheapest one is the top of bank, which is the most traditional type of path, and obviously the most, as I mentioned, cost effective for us. In this case, we are also finding in some location that the demand exceeds the width of right of way that we have on top of bank. And so we might have to go across onto the river on cantilevered structures, even for top of bank. In the most constrained areas where there is absolutely no available right of way, we are looking to possibly cutting into the trapezoidal channel walls and creating a path along the river channel itself. So really, partially down on the channel wall. We're calling it the incised path. And this is going to be evaluated from a number of perspectives, especially how high it will be and how it might be impacting the main objective of the river, which is serving as a flood channel. At the same time, making sure that people are safe on such a path, because it is halfway down on the channel. And then on the other hand, this inside path is a great way of creating space out of nowhere. And then getting around some of the bridges, it might be the most efficient way of maneuvering the bridges. We did consider the bottom of the channel where we put the path on the river bed, but we decided not to advance this option to further design because of a few reasons. A, because it really does not meet the needs of the path, which is to be a world-class amenity. It does not provide excellent user experience. It obviously cannot be open all year long because of rain. And it may not serve both recreational and utilitarian trips. Funnily enough, people think LA is dry. Yes, we don't get much, but sometimes we do. While most of the time this river is kind of dry with a small trickle of water, there are times when the river does fill up and become rushing rapid. And that was probably the primary reason why, while back in 1930s, the river was channelized and concretized by the Army Corps of Engineers. So we absolutely want to make sure that we are designing a path that can be used as much as possible while minimizing any damage that could happen to the trail so that it can be operated and maintained effectively and efficiently. Next slide. So like we considered different path typologies, we also considered the use typology, I would call, depending on the width of the river, width of the path, whether that be shared or as separated use for a variety of different path widths. Overall, along this 8-mile corridor, we're really looking at employing a context-sensitive and a context-specific design based on the demand analytics. Anywhere along the 8-mile corridor, in some spaces, this will be shared and sometimes it will be separated, as I mentioned. So this 14-foot path that we are looking is in the smaller end of a shared use. It has to be kept in mind that when we are talking about shared use, it would be used by bicycles as well as people walking. And they may or may not be responding to the needs and the demands of the path. So we we have looked at various alternatives. We've looked at a 14-foot, a 16-foot, an 18, and a 20-foot path width. So moving to the next one. The next one is is this the 16 feet? Yeah, thank you. So this is the 16 feet share used, which is slightly wider, 2 feet wider than the 14-foot path. It gives a little bit more room for people to spread out. And this is going to work in few more areas than the 14-foot. Again, it may not be able to accommodate the entire need for the path. So we have two types of separated use, and that'll be the next two slides. Thank you. So an 18-foot, and I will talk about the 20-foot later. And so in this instance, we are looking to allocate 20-foot wide width for the rolling component, anybody on wheels, and a walking component of 6 foot wide with a 2 feet buffer between the two types of paths. Moving to the next slide. And then we have obviously the 20-foot separated use. It's a 14-foot in this case for rolling path and a 6 feet wide walking path. Obviously, as you can see, that it's such a constrained corridor that we are trying to create space out of nowhere and building a lot of this on structure, whether that be elevated structure or cutting into the walls or out onto the river. So cost is a very important consideration. So we are really trying to match our resources with the demands for the path. On that note, let me hand it over to Devin to take a deep dive on the origin destination analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitali. It's a great point for us to all consider. This corridor is highly constrained. A lot of it is going to be on structure, so every square foot is precious and every square foot is costly. So the purpose of the origins and destination analysis to help us really get at demand and begin to balance demand with overarching cost for the corridor. So Mike mentioned early in the presentation about a range of ways to begin to assess demand. And for this particular effort, looking at origins and destinations, we used a regression modeling technique and then balanced that with some sketch planning to kind of ground truth some of our findings and began to really identify kind of where people are moving from and to, and how many people would be crossing our corridor or potentially replacing one of their existing trips by using our corridor. And the end result of that was this, what you see here is a series of estimated daily trips. The previous slide also talked about the daily trips in 2017 and also projected out decades down the road, because the goal of this study and these daily trips that you see here is to make sure that we're building a path that's going to accommodate users on day one as well as decades from now, because this investment is crucial. It's crucial that we get this investment right the first time. So you can see on the left-hand side here example projects, thinking about things like the Iron Horse Trail or the East Bank Esplanade, what size or what width facility they have and how many trips per day they're seeing. So in the case of Iron Horse, 1,200 trips per day, whereas the East Bank Esplanade, upwards of 3,000 trips. CV Link project, which is just partially constructed, is estimating up to upwards of 3,000 trips per day. And then on the other end of the spectrum, actually just down the road from this project, is the Santa Monica Beach Trail, which on peak hours, peak days, is seeing 10,000 trips per day. So really substantial numbers. And you can see what we're looking at for the LA River Path based on our O&D study is kind of on the lighter side, farther down in the south or up in the north, anywhere from 1,700 to 2,200 trips to the most dense area in the downtown, where nearly 6,000 trips. So it's a substantial number of trips per day. And those trips translate directly to the path width that Mitali was outlining earlier, because we want to make sure that the path that we're designing for is going to accommodate that total density of demand. And the way we were able to translate that demand into, actually an evaluation of potential pathway widths and separated versus shared use is by using the level of service model that Mike had talked about earlier. He mentioned that he likes to think about it as how much water can you fit into a particular pipe. And that's what we were looking at here, using a shared use path, our total number of demand, or our total number of users per day based on our demand, and really getting at kind of how wide does the path need to be to create or to provide a great and frankly safe experience for multiple users. You'll see in some instances where the demand was exceedingly high, actually a separated use path is the most appropriate. So separating out our pedestrians from our rolling modes to be able to accommodate a pathway, or basically to be able to provide a pathway that will make for a safe and pleasant experience for all users. And the end result of that, so taking the O&D estimate, then working that through our demand analysis, and then translating that to a level of service, it results in a series of segments along the corridor. And really the importance of this is it really validates what Mitali was describing earlier, that there's a range of different path types available to us, and it can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. I mean, frankly, the budget won't accommodate a one-size-fits-all approach. And so what we're able to do is focus our resources in areas of high demand, providing the best possible path typology and the best possible user experience. So you can see the pathway navigates from 16 feet wide shared use, navigating to transitioning to an 18 foot wide separated use, and then getting as wide as 20 feet in the downtown core before it narrows back out to 18 feet, and then eventually to 16 feet as a shared use as it navigates down into the southern end of the project. So it's important to understand that kind of data storytelling arc of using all of our O&D, and then how that eventually translates to actual design decisions. And finally, an effort that Mike touched on as well is level of comfort. And really that's what we're beginning to engage in now. So the project has developed 3 alternatives. And one of the many components for assessing or evaluating those alternatives is using this level of comfort tool to really get at the user experience. Thinking about things like level of service and comparing that between the 3 alternatives, but also thinking about slopes, stress, number of junctions, land use context or climate, to begin to really assess the quality of the user experience on each alternative. So that's where we are in the process currently, but we're also doing many other things as this project moves forward. And so I'll pass it back to Mitali to describe to you some of our next steps.
So, so this project is funded by Measure M, LA County's Measure M. And we are, as I mentioned, that we are in the environmental phase. We are hoping to clear CEQA and select the locally preferred alternative of the LPA by mid-2023, with the intent of opening this amazing project by the 2028 Olympics that Los Angeles is going to host. We do have our live chat session going on. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and type into the chat, and we will respond to those as we go along this conference session.
Great. Thanks so much, Mitali and Devin, for telling us a lot about that really amazing project. The next case study we're going to talk about is going from Southern California up to Northern California. And the Iron Horse Trail is one of the oldest and largest multi-use trails in the Bay Area. So this 32-mile trail really is a treasured community asset. And because it's so well used, the 10-foot trail often runs into capacity issues today. So Contra Costa County wanted to explore the feasibility of improving the corridor to serve as an active transportation spine that really can support the region's mobility goals while still providing that treasured recreational resource. So we led a feasibility study for the county that looked at what investments and improvements are needed for the corridor to really serve as a regional bicycle superhighway. So we took an analytical approach to assessing the corridor and its potential. So we looked at things like demographics of the communities and how they're changing, what destinations are accessible, who's using the trail today, and if there's any existing safety issues, and then connectivities of communities to the trail. We approached the analytics through a network-based approach that started by evaluating the quality of the existing bikeway connections to the trails. And we did this by measuring the level of traffic stress. So level of traffic stress, or LTS, is a metric that relates the type and experience of different users to the type of bicycle facility provided. So LTS1 facilities like trails are comfortable for all ages and abilities, while LTS4 facilities, I would say like an arterial road with a shared bike lane, are more comfortable to only the most fearless bicyclists. So we mapped the accessibility of various destinations based on using only low stress routes to get to the trail. So these maps show that you can see a greater accessibility of in the blue colors. So on the left, looking at accessibility to parks and transit and shopping and office. And again, that's from the trail to these destinations along the existing low stress routes. We also looked at overall connectivity for people walking, biking, and on using e-bikes based on representative distances each mode will travel. And what we found is that only about 35% of people who live in the study area are currently within comfortable walking and biking distance to the existing trail. So now that we had that as a baseline mode, we could use scenario planning to help assess what type of improvements would get more people to use the corridor. So I'm going to go through 3 of the scenarios that we ran. And the first one, we asked, what if you improved all the intersections along the trail? Would you get a lot more users if it was just a straight shot? So that would mean grade separations for all the arterial crossings, traffic signals at all the collector streets, and then at local crossings, you know, we reoriented the stop signs so people driving cars would stop and trail users would have priority. And using a measurement of perceived distance, it would only really make the trail feel 14% shorter. So these improvements don't have that large of an increase in ridership, but really what these improvements would do are more about improving safety, which is equally important consideration when our goal is to get more people onto the trail. We also have more people to keep safe. So in the second scenario, we asked, well, what if you built comfortable connections to all the trails? So if we took all of those high traffic stress routes and made them all ages and ability corridors for people to access the trail. So now we have all these blue and green lines on the map instead of red lines. You'd see 23% of all trips are more bikeable. So that would lead to a more significant increase in trail demand. And so it really shows the importance about improving first and last mile connections to trails. And then the third scenario, we were looking at, if all trips were made by e-bikes. So we know that people on e-bikes travel faster and therefore make trips that are 22% longer than people on traditional bikes. And so when we ran that scenario, we found that 27% of all trips are bikeable. And so again, these scenarios are sort of building the case and helping compare investments to benefits and using this tool as a way to bring these results to the community and stakeholders to really help them understand the corridor potential and benefits of the various improvements. So there's also a long-term interest in the Iron Horse Corridor to provide a new dedicated low-speed shared autonomous vehicle, or SAV, route along the corridor. And so through this study, we did a preliminary analysis, and we really found that there's 2 key things that need to happen to continue that technology. And the first is really to conduct community outreach to establish goals for a pilot project. Community members, we heard, are concerned about SAVs along their existing trail. And these concerns include safety, noise, and the potential to change the character of neighborhoods surrounding the trail. So anytime you're looking at taking an existing trail corridor and thinking about expanding it and creating new uses, it is going to, it is best to really engage the community and get their feedback on the new vision of what a corridor needs. And then the second is really understanding the policy, technical, infrastructure, and operational requirements of running an SAV program. So there is a current SAV pilot project in San Ramon, which is in the southern end of this corridor. But SAVs have not been tested in a naturalized environment such as the trail. So right now, objects in their path, including other modes like people on a skateboard or pedestrians, are seen as perceived obstacles, and they require the SAV to stop. So right now, the SAV would require a dedicated track, not mixed with trail users. So there are some spatial constraints in the corridor that prevent a dedicated track right now, but there are areas highlighted in green where a pilot project could be explored further. So after we conducted all of the analytical work, we did set up a framework for a needs analysis to really help establish what trail improvements were moving forward. And so the study recommended a 22-foot wide separated use trail, and also improving intersections, and including some grade intersection or grade separations along the route. Access enhancements included reorienting the front door of adjacent businesses to the trail corridor and focus on developing some trail-oriented development. And finally, recommended a new management approach, because when you transition a trail from a recreational trail to a transportation route, it needs to have the funding to support the operations and management for its new use. So that brings me to the end. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the live chat and we will meet up there. I'm going to hand it now to Devin, who's going to talk about the Great Redwood Trail.
Yeah, thanks. So we went from 8 miles to 30 plus miles to now 300 miles. So definitely different scales and different overall character. For those of you who joined in on the Great Redwood Trail session, this will be a little bit redundant, so I'll be fairly brief. But this trail project, if you go to the next slide, Emily, is a project that was studied, or the feasibility component was studied as part of State Bill's 1029 task force. And really it's looking at the existing North Coast Rail Authority's right-of-way and transitioning that over to a trail corridor. So that stretches from the North Bay area all the way up into Humboldt County, to the small town of Corbell, which is close to Arcata. So it's a very long, very large trail corridor that's been assessed from a rail perspective, but this was really the first time to assess it from a trail perspective. And the importance of this particular session is getting at this data storytelling. So this is beginning to look at how you can collect the volume of data. All the other, the previous case studies had data available. We were in urban environments where counts either existed or we were able to go out and collect counts. In this instance, all of that data needed to be collected firsthand, and it needed to be consistent across 300 miles. So the project that was led as part of the State Bill 1029 task force, California State Parks was the overall lead, and Ascent Environmental was the prime consultant. And Alta was supporting as part of that project team to help go out there and collect and build this data so we could really tell the story of the Great Redwood Trail. And it began with consistently assessing all of the existing infrastructure along the corridor. So things like tunnels, bridges, geomorphic activities, road crossings. There's a range of existing infrastructure that needed to go out or needed to be assessed. And this is a tool that will be uploaded and is available for others to use who are doing long trail corridor projects to quickly approach something like a tunnel and assess, is it optimal, great, good, poor, and does it meet certain components and criteria? Keep in mind, over 300 miles, there were 3 teams deployed. If you go to the next slide, Emily, we needed to make sure that each of those teams that were navigating anywhere between 6 and 12 miles a day were recording all of that data consistently. So what you can see on the right here is one of those data inventory sheets. And I know it's very tiny. But what's most important about this is understanding that this inventory sheet, what it was designed to do is follow the milepost system, starting from south and traversing north. People, the teams walked on foot, and when they would come across an existing piece of inventory, they would photo document it, which was time stamped and geolocated, and then they would assess its existing condition. So what we're doing is collecting a range of photo inventory information as well as on the ground assessment. And we were able to, over the course of a few weeks, assess all 300 miles of this corridor, which keep in mind is very rugged in certain areas, in particular in the Eel River Canyon. So it was quite a feat, and we needed to be very efficient and consistent across this inventory. And the results of that, I mentioned collecting these photos and this data, was collecting a corridor-wide map of all of these existing constraints and challenges that we were faced with. And you can see here what we did is we laid this out. This is part of a larger roll plot that was then presented to the State Bill 1029 Task Force team, but we also translated that into GIS, into a Google Earth KMZ with a whole photo inventory. So all the participants from SB 1029 could kind of fly through the corridor and get a sense for themselves the conditions of the existing infrastructure. And then taking that existing infrastructure or that existing inventory of the infrastructure, we were able to begin to assess the corridor. So the corridor was split up into 57 individual segments, and these segments were all organized so that they could provide independent utility. And we started to apply, or I would say just weigh the infrastructure constraints to the opportunities along the corridor. So for instance, a collapsed tunnel being obviously a big constraint along a segment, whereas access to a large local population where there's high potential demand or overlapping an existing or planned trail project as a great opportunity. And we're able to begin to assess each of these segments relative to one another. And the result you see here is this, again, that roll plot map. This is looking up in the Arcata area, where each individual segment, you can see one provides more opportunities. So for instance, the dark green that you see around the Humboldt Bay area there is in a higher demand area. It's part of an actual project that's being implemented currently, versus you see the orange segment down to the south by Rio Del, which has highly constrained infrastructure conditions and lower population density, so more challenging conditions to implement. And what's important here is you can then take this information, and that's what we did as part of the feasibility assessment, and you can begin to prioritize segments. So what you can do is take a look at where you have the most opportunities and group those up. And what we did is we developed 5 key phases for implementation priorities. And Mike mentioned this, it's been touched on in each session, but by doing an overarching trail demand analysis, where you can start to look at not only number of users per day, in the case of the Great Redwood Trail, if fully built out, it's 1.4 million users annually, which is significant. To give you a sense, the Empire State Trail, which is 750 miles, sees around 8 million users per day, versus the Katy Trail in Missouri, which is closer in size, it's 240 miles. That has around 400,000 users per day. So you can see the Great Redwood Trail is kind of in the middle there. But by understanding those demand and the density of demand, you can start to see what the actual benefits are. So fewer vehicle miles traveled per day, which translates to reduction in CO2 emissions, and also results in greater, social, economic, and health benefits as well. So this is all outlined in the feasibility study, but it's important to understand how demand can then play into that data storytelling arc. And finally, kind of similar to what we're faced with along the LA River Path, this long, big corridor, just like most trail projects, it can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. And so by better understanding the physical constraints, the existing conditions, so what's out there and what are we faced with on the ground in terms of infrastructure conditions, and understanding the trail demand and overall expected use, we can start to develop a series of trail typologies that kind of best, as Mitali put it, are best fit the needs of the specific context. They're context sensitive, and frankly, they're cost sensitive as well. And with that, I'll just close by saying that this project is just completed the feasibility study, and the importance of this particular case study is showing how you can collect that information right from the outset, how you can do it efficiently, and then how you can translate that together and turn it into a story that you can tell as part of a feasibility assessment, and really begin to understand the overarching opportunities for your trail project.